Yesterday, we told you about 4 migrant boats stopped off our coast, 3 of them right here in Fort Pierce. Now we've learned those boats have ties to what federal agents say is an international conspiracy investigation. A warning law enforcement says is just the beginning.
They were flying in pretty fast. I saw all the government roll in the inlet, lights, sirens, everything.
On board, 30 Chinese nationals, including 2 children, 5 Bahamians, and 168 kilograms of cocaine.
So first you live and you work here, but you have plane tickets from to the Bahamas. Why? This is not looking good.
We can save one life. One life. We have done amazing work, and today we have saved thousands and thousands of lives as a result of this incredible cooperation.
As 3 boats departed from the Fort Pierce Inlet, St. Lucie County Sheriff investigators, along with several state and federal agencies, were ready and waiting for their return. The boats, all between 33 and 42 feet, were spotted, with 2 complying and the 3rd trying to escape.
The waves rolled in quietly along Florida's Treasure Coast, but beneath the calm surface lay a brewing storm. Before dawn, the Fort Pierce Inlet became the stage for one of the most significant anti-smuggling operations the region had seen in years. Federal agents, local deputies, and maritime patrol units moved like shadows across the water, waiting for the right moment to strike. Their quarry was no ordinary group of opportunistic smugglers. This was a cartel-backed network, professional, international, and disciplined, using Florida's beaches as the latest front line for moving people and cocaine into the United States. The mission had been in motion for days. Investigators had tracked whispers of unusual maritime activity, monitored suspicious Airbnb rentals, and followed the movements of men who seemed out of place in quiet neighborhoods. Intelligence suggested that boats were arriving from the Bahamas, not with fishermen or tourists, but with human cargo and bricks of cocaine. The operation culminated in the early hours of the morning, when 3 boats slipped out of the Fort Pierce Inlet under cover of darkness. These were not pleasure crafts. They were 33 to 42-foot vessels built for speed and stealth, outfitted to handle the perilous crossing to and from the Bahamas. When the boats returned, the trap closed. 2 of the vessels complied, forced to a halt by flashing lights and armed agents. The 3rd, an intermarine, gunned its engines in a desperate attempt to escape. What followed was a cinematic chase across the water, U.S. Customs and Border Protection boats and Coast Guard cutters giving pursuit. It did not last long. The intermarine was disabled quickly, and its crew overpowered. The haul inside revealed the scale of the crime. 30 Chinese nationals, including 2 children, along with 5 Bahamian smugglers, and 370 pounds of cocaine. On nearby beaches, surveillance teams linked to the smugglers were arrested, their radios and lookout positions exposed. By sunrise, 38 arrests had been made, and the first phase of a larger investigation was complete. Behind the scenes, the operation had been carefully orchestrated from an unassuming vacation rental. On the surface, the Fort Pierce Airbnb looked like any other weekend getaway spot. But inside, it was a command center, maps spread across tables, routes charted, teams assigned. Smuggling coordinators used it to manage the movements of boats and surveillance crews, blending into a community that had no idea its shoreline was being transformed into an international crime corridor. Detectives from the St. Lucie County Sheriff's Office, tipped off by intelligence that boats from the Bahamas were carrying both narcotics and migrants, had been watching the operation for days. Their vigilance, combined with federal cooperation, ensured the smugglers walked straight into a waiting net. The list of agencies involved reads like a roll call of American law enforcement. DEA, FBI, Homeland Security Investigations, Customs and Border Protection, Coast Guard, Florida Fish and Wildlife, Highway Patrol, and of course, local deputies. Together, they converged in the dark hours of the morning, striking with precision at 5:30 a.m. Sheriff Richard Del Toro would later tell reporters that their county would not become a gateway for organized crime. His deputies, many with salt spray still clinging to their uniforms, had proven that point in dramatic fashion. But the significance of the Fort Pierce operation extends far beyond Florida's coastline. It highlights a broader shift in smuggling strategies across the Western Hemisphere. For years, the U.S. southern border with Mexico has been the focus of national debate and enforcement. Walls were built, checkpoints expanded, and surveillance intensified. As land routes tightened, cartels and smuggling networks adapted. If there are three ways into the United States, land, sea, and air, then logic dictated that smugglers would shift toward the latter two. The Fort Pierce arrests are living proof of that evolution. Florida, with its hundreds of miles of vulnerable coastline, has become a new battleground. For the cartels, the business model is brutally efficient. Migrants, often desperate and willing to pay anything for a chance at a new life, are funneled into the Bahamas, where entry requirements are comparatively lenient. From there, the final leg of the journey, across the water to Florida, can cost $30,000 to $35,000 per person. For those involved, the sums are staggering. The cargo on just one of the seized boats represented nearly $1 million in smuggling fees, not to mention the street value of the cocaine. For the people on board, the cost was more than financial. Families had sold homes, borrowed against futures, and gambled everything, only to end the journey in handcuffs, with the specter of deportation hanging over them. The human dimension of the Fort Pierce incident is perhaps the most tragic. The 30 Chinese nationals aboard those vessels were not criminals in the conventional sense. They were people caught in the machinery of exploitation, treated as disposable cargo. Among them were children, carried as symbols of innocence, but also as shields, human camouflage for drug shipments. Smugglers have long used the desperation of families to their advantage, weaving vulnerable people into their operations as both profit centers and tactical assets. For the children, the journey is more than a physical trial. It becomes a lifelong scar. Dreams of freedom are replaced by memories of fear, detention, and betrayal. The cocaine seized, 168 kilograms, was destined for American streets, another node in the endless cycle of supply and demand. Each brick represented not only profit for cartels, but also countless future overdoses, broken families, and the ripple effects of addiction. Sheriff Del Toro made it clear that his county would not become complicit in feeding that cycle. "We will not tolerate criminals using our shoreline as a point of entry," he declared, promising more marine patrols and tighter coastal defenses. His words were not mere rhetoric. The operation demonstrated the effectiveness of interagency cooperation, a muscle that had atrophied in some areas but was flexed with force in Fort Pierce. The warning to cartels was clear. The coastline is not a soft target. Florida law enforcement, working hand in glove with federal agencies, is ready to adapt as quickly as smugglers. And yet, even in victory, agents on the ground voiced caution. They described the arrests not as the end, but as the beginning, a small fracture in a vast and resilient network. Intelligence suggests that the smuggling chain stretches far beyond the Bahamas, linking to Southeast Asia and China, with cartel operatives using military-style tactics to shield their operations. The scale is global, the profits immense, and the risks seemingly outweighed by reward. The statistics paint a stark picture. In July 2024, U.S. border authorities recorded 453 narcotic seizures on land. By July 2025, that number had plummeted to just 33, evidence of how tightly land routes have been constricted. But while land seizures fell, maritime and air interceptions surged. In 2024, more than 1,000 such cases were documented. By mid-2025, the number had already surpassed 800, with projections indicating another record-breaking year. The Fort Pierce bust is one chapter in that trend, a data point in a larger story of adaptation, resilience, and relentless pursuit of profit. For Chinese migrants, the stakes are uniquely high. Unlike other groups, they face additional risks if caught and deported. In China, being sent back after attempting to defect can be treated as a grave betrayal of the state, sometimes punished as treason. For many, the dangerous sea crossing is not just a last resort, but the only conceivable path forward. That desperation makes them prime targets for cartels, who dangle the promise of safety and freedom while pocketing tens of thousands of dollars. For the families who attempt the crossing, the dream of America is often shattered on a Florida shoreline, leaving financial ruin and emotional devastation in its place. The deeper one examines the Fort Pierce operation, the clearer it becomes that this was not merely a regional incident, but a snapshot of a global chess match between law enforcement and criminal syndicates. Smuggling networks are like rivers. When blocked in one direction, they carve out new paths, often more treacherous and destructive. The transformation of Florida into a maritime corridor underscores how adaptable and ruthless these organizations can be. While some observers view the confrontation at Fort Pierce as a spectacular victory for authorities, many insiders are quick to temper that enthusiasm. "This is only the beginning," one federal agent admitted after the arrests. "We're seeing the first ripples of a much larger wave." At the heart of this evolution lies the cartel business model. Unlike small-time smugglers who might attempt to sneak across a border fence or load a few migrants onto a fishing boat, cartel operations are defined by scale, sophistication, and global connectivity. Their networks stretch across continents, bringing together financiers, logisticians, boat captains, and even surveillance teams planted on U.S. soil. The Fort Pierce Airbnb, discovered to be a command hub, illustrates this level of organization. From that temporary base, assignments were handed out, watch schedules arranged, and routes plotted with military precision. The smugglers understood that American law enforcement had become more aggressive, and they adapted by mimicking the very structures used to hunt them. Counter-surveillance played a key role in their plan. Teams were placed strategically along the beaches, tasked with monitoring police movements and relaying warnings back to the boats. These were not random lookouts, but trained operatives, part of the system of layered defenses designed to prevent interdiction. The fact that local deputies identified and captured these counter-surveillance operatives shows how deeply law enforcement had penetrated the network's strategy. For once, the hunters had outmaneuvered the hunted. But in exposing these tactics, authorities also confirmed the cartel's increasing willingness to treat U.S. soil as their own battleground, embedding personnel on American beaches as if they were extensions of cartel territory. From an economic perspective, the operation reveals a grim equation. Migrant smuggling has become one of the fastest-growing profit centers for cartels, rivaling drug trafficking in its potential returns. A kilogram of cocaine, once smuggled into the United States, may yield tens of thousands of dollars. A single migrant, meanwhile, represents a guaranteed payout of $30,000 to $35,000 before even stepping foot on U.S. soil. When multiplied by dozens or even hundreds of passengers per month, the profits skyrocket into the millions. Unlike drugs, which carry the risk of being confiscated and destroyed, people cannot simply be seized and discarded. They remain valuable until captured, at which point the cost is borne not by the cartels, but by the migrants themselves, who are deported or detained. It is a low-risk, high-reward enterprise from the perspective of organized crime. The Fort Pierce case also shines a harsh light on the plight of the individuals caught in this machinery. For the 30 Chinese nationals rescued, or more accurately, arrested that dawn, the journey had already consumed everything they owned. Families had liquidated assets, borrowed money, or mortgaged futures in the hope of providing a better life for their children. Many had no illusions about the danger. They understood the sea crossing was perilous. Yet desperation outweighed fear. Once placed aboard the boats, however, they ceased to be passengers and became commodities. In the eyes of the smugglers, their lives were interchangeable with the bricks of cocaine hidden beside them. To the cartels, people and drugs are simply different currencies, both tradable, both profitable, both expendable. Law enforcement officers on the scene could not ignore the human suffering. Special agents described the look of exhaustion and terror etched into the faces of the migrants, particularly the children. Federal agencies are trained to view operations through the lens of interdiction and prosecution, but even seasoned officers admitted to being shaken. One Coast Guard official reflected, "If we saved even one child's life today, then it was worth it." Yet the reality remains harsh. After a brief period of processing, many of these migrants will be deported, returned to countries where they may face punishment far more severe than imprisonment. For Chinese nationals, deportation can mean public disgrace, economic ruin, and sometimes accusations of betraying the state itself. In a cruel irony, the very escape they sought may transform into a deeper form of captivity upon their return. Beyond the human cost, the cocaine seizure itself adds another layer of complexity. 168 kilograms of narcotics represent more than just an impressive bust. They are a direct financial blow to the cartel involved. Every lost shipment disrupts the supply chain, forces cartels to recalculate, and occasionally sparks violent reprisals among rival factions. Law enforcement agencies know that each seizure sends shockwaves through the underworld economy, but they also understand that seizures alone cannot dismantle the system. For every shipment intercepted, others may slip through undetected. The cartels calculate losses as part of their business model, accepting that a percentage of their shipments will be captured. Much like any legitimate corporation accounts for spoilage or damaged goods. Sheriff Del Toro's stern warning that St. Lucie County would not become a cartel gateway resonated with local residents. For a community that prides itself on safety and small-town values, the revelation that an international smuggling network was operating out of a neighborhood Airbnb was deeply unsettling. The sheriff pledged to increase marine patrols, invest in technology, and strengthen ties with federal partners. For him, the incident underscored the necessity of interagency cooperation. "This is what happens when everyone works together," he told reporters, pointing to the seamless coordination among DEA, FBI, Homeland Security, CBP, and his own deputies. Such unity had been rare in the past, often undermined by bureaucratic rivalry or fragmented communication. Fort Pierce proved that collaboration could deliver results and save lives. Yet questions remain about sustainability. Can such high-level cooperation be maintained over time, especially as cartels continue to evolve? Experts caution that the smugglers' defeat in Fort Pierce may simply push them toward new tactics, faster boats, stealthier routes, or even the use of drones and semi-submersibles could become part of the arsenal. Already, intelligence reports hint at networks experimenting with unmanned craft to ferry drugs across short distances. Others suggest that cartel operatives may soon exploit legitimate shipping containers, hiding migrants or narcotics among cargo to blend into legal trade. For law enforcement, every success risks sparking a new set of challenges, as cartels treat each setback as an opportunity for innovation. Another layer of complexity is the geopolitical dimension, and the fact that the smuggling pipeline extended from China to the Bahamas, then into Florida, illustrates how international the problem has become. It is no longer a simple case of Mexican cartels moving goods north across land. Instead, we see alliances spanning continents, connecting criminal syndicates in Asia, the Caribbean, and the United States. Such global networks require equally global responses, yet international cooperation is often fraught with challenges, differences in legal systems, corruption in partner nations, and conflicting political interests. Even as U.S. agencies celebrate the Fort Pierce success, they acknowledge the difficulty of replicating it elsewhere without strong allies willing to confront the cartels head-on. Public reaction to the incident has been a mix of relief and alarm. Residents of Fort Pierce expressed gratitude for the swift action that prevented their community from becoming a staging ground for organized crime. But many also admitted to a newfound sense of vulnerability. If such a sophisticated network could operate undetected for weeks, how many others might exist along Florida's 2,300 miles of coastline? Each inlet, each marina, each sleepy seaside town could be a potential entry point. The challenge for authorities is to provide reassurance without creating a false sense of security. As Sheriff Del Toro noted, vigilance must become a permanent state, not a temporary reaction. If the Fort Pierce bust was a wake-up call, then the weeks and months that follow will test whether that wake-up leads to real, lasting vigilance. Law enforcement veterans know that victories can breed complacency, and complacency is precisely what cartels depend on. A single raid, even one as dramatic as the seizure of 3 boats and the arrest of nearly 40 people, cannot erase the structural drivers that make smuggling so profitable. Poverty, desperation, and demand form the trinity that sustains the underground economy. As long as families feel trapped in oppressive circumstances, as long as cocaine continues to command a high price in the United States, and as long as routes remain available, there will always be a market for those willing to gamble with the law. The Fort Pierce case highlights how demand itself perpetuates the problem. Cocaine consumption in the U.S. remains robust despite decades of enforcement and education. Cartels understand this better than anyone. They know that as long as Americans continue to purchase their product, the risks of interdiction are simply another cost of doing business. The 168 kilograms of cocaine seized in this operation may represent millions of dollars lost, but cartels already factor such seizures into their operating budgets. For them, every lost shipment is like a business write-off. They can absorb the hit, restructure, and replace the product. This is why many analysts argue that enforcement alone, while necessary, cannot resolve the crisis. To truly undercut the cartels, one must address demand, a challenge that reaches into the cultural and economic fabric of American life. Still, enforcement has symbolic value, and the Fort Pierce raid delivered a powerful message. It showed both the cartels and the public that U.S. agencies are willing to adapt and that local sheriffs can work shoulder to shoulder with federal giants. The optics of Coast Guard cutters racing across the inlet, DEA agents storming a suburban Airbnb, and sheriff's deputies arresting counter-surveillance teams are not just law enforcement actions. They are public statements. They reassure residents that their community is not defenseless. They warn smugglers that the sea, once considered a softer point of entry than the land border, is being watched more closely than ever before. Yet one cannot ignore the humanitarian dimension that runs parallel to the enforcement narrative. The 30 Chinese nationals found aboard the boats embody a story of hope turned to despair. These individuals did not risk the crossing out of recklessness. They risked it because every other door appeared closed. China's strict visa policies and tight control over emigration create barriers that push citizens toward underground networks. Once ensnared in the cartel system, their lives become bargaining chips. They are told that for $30,000 or $35,000 they can find freedom, but what they purchase instead is peril. The children among them serve as painful symbols, innocence leveraged for profit, hope manipulated into vulnerability. This duality, criminal profit versus human suffering, is what makes modern smuggling so morally corrosive. Cartels profit not only by exploiting addiction, but also by commodifying desperation. In their calculus, a human being has no more inherent value than a kilo of cocaine. Both can be sold, both can be discarded, both can be replaced. It is this cold efficiency that makes them formidable adversaries. They are not bound by the rules of morality or law. For every child taken aboard as a shield, for every parent forced to mortgage their life savings, there are cartel accountants tallying profits with chilling detachment. Authorities recognize this, and many officers involved in the Fort Pierce operation were candid about the moral weight of their work. Saving lives is not always about rescuing people from drowning at sea. Sometimes it is about breaking the chain that treats human beings as cargo. Sheriff Del Toro's insistence that if we saved even one life today, we did our job, resonated deeply because it captured the essence of the operation's stakes. It was not just about seizing drugs or arresting smugglers. It was about confronting a system that reduces human dignity to a price tag. The broader trend lines paint a sobering picture. U.S. Customs and Border Protection data confirms that while drug seizures on land have plummeted since 2024, maritime and aerial interceptions are surging. This suggests that cartels are deliberately shifting to exploit vulnerabilities at sea. Florida, with its vast coastline and numerous inlets, is a prime target. The geography itself works against law enforcement. Unlike the land border, where barriers and checkpoints can be erected, the sea offers infinite points of entry. Every inlet, every hidden cove, every marina could become a gateway. To monitor them all is an almost impossible task. Even with radar, drones, and patrol boats, the ocean remains a space where smugglers can hide in plain sight. Cartels are also innovators. The Fort Pierce boats were ordinary in appearance, but extraordinary in purpose. They were designed not for fishing or leisure, but for efficiency in crossing international waters. Tomorrow, the designs may evolve further. Faster hulls, stealth coatings, semi-submersibles. Intelligence agencies have already tracked cartel experiments with drones capable of carrying small but valuable payloads across short distances. Others have noted attempts to use legitimate shipping containers as Trojan horses for migrants or narcotics. Every time law enforcement closes one door, cartels test another. It is a cat-and-mouse game played on a global scale, with billions of dollars at stake. International cooperation will therefore become essential. The Fort Pierce operation succeeded in part because U.S. agencies coordinated across jurisdictions, but sustaining momentum requires collaboration beyond American shores. The Bahamas, as a launch point for many of these smuggling ventures, plays a central role. Its immigration policies and geographic proximity make it an ideal staging area for cartels. Without strong Bahamian partnership, enforcement efforts will always be reactive rather than proactive. The same holds true for Asian nations like China, whose citizens are being funneled into the pipeline. Unless countries coordinate to disrupt recruitment and financing at the source, Florida will continue to face waves of human and narcotics smuggling. At the community level, Fort Pierce itself has been forced to reckon with its new place on the map. For decades, the town was known more for fishing and quiet beaches than for international crime. The revelation that an Airbnb in the heart of the community was being used as a cartel command post has unsettled residents. It raises uncomfortable questions. How many other houses might be operating as hubs? How many strangers in the neighborhood might not be tourists but traffickers? The line between ordinary life and global crime has blurred in ways that are deeply disorienting for local families. For parents, the sight of children being taken off smuggling boats strikes an especially raw nerve. It personalizes the crisis. It transforms abstract debates about immigration policy into visceral images of frightened faces and small bodies bundled in blankets. It forces residents to see not just criminals, but also victims. Victims who, despite their illegal entry, are still children deserving of compassion. That dual recognition, that communities must be both safe and humane, is perhaps the hardest balance for law enforcement and society alike to achieve. In the immediate aftermath, Sheriff Del Toro has promised to scale up marine patrols, invest in more advanced detection equipment, and strengthen ties with federal agencies. The hope is that the Fort Pierce raid can serve as both deterrent and model. If cartels see Florida as a hardened target, they may reconsider. If other counties replicate the strategy of deep coordination, the impact could ripple across the coastline. But even as optimism flickers, seasoned officers know the truth. The cartels are watching too. They study law enforcement as closely as law enforcement studies them. Every move is measured, every tactic analyzed. And somewhere, far beyond the calm waters of Fort Pierce, another plan is already being written. As the dust settles on the Fort Pierce operation, the implications continue to ripple outward. What happened before dawn that day was more than a tactical success. It was a glimpse into the future of border enforcement and the evolving landscape of global crime. For every person arrested, every kilo of cocaine seized, and every surveillance team dismantled, there lies a sobering reality. This is just one battle in a war that stretches across oceans and continents. Cartels do not operate in isolation. They are networks that span hemispheres, weaving together elements of finance, logistics, and brute force. The pipeline uncovered in Florida connected Chinese migrants, Bahamian intermediaries, Caribbean maritime routes, and American coastlines in a seamless operation. Such complexity reveals not only the reach of these organizations, but also their resilience. Shutting down one node does not collapse the network. It merely forces it to adapt. This is why Sheriff Del Toro's warning that his county will not become a gateway must be understood in a broader context. Fort Pierce may no longer be viable, but another inlet, another town, another coastline may soon be tested. The adaptability of these networks also raises profound policy questions. Traditional law enforcement methods, raids, arrests, seizures, are essential but insufficient. They are the equivalent of trimming the branches of a tree while leaving its roots intact. The roots, in this case, are entrenched social and economic forces, global inequality, political repression, the relentless demand for narcotics. Until those roots are addressed, the branches will keep growing back. For U.S. policymakers, this means that enforcement must be paired with diplomacy, economic development, and cultural awareness. Cooperation with nations like the Bahamas, investment in anti-corruption initiatives, and targeted programs that address migrant vulnerabilities may prove just as crucial as patrol boats and interdiction squads. The humanitarian consequences are especially pressing. The image of 30 Chinese nationals, including children, packed onto smuggling vessels should force a reckoning. Migration is not inherently criminal. It is often a response to desperation. But when pathways to legal migration are limited or closed, underground markets emerge. Those markets are not run by benevolent guides, but by cartels that see migrants as commodities. For the individuals trapped in this system, the journey rarely ends in freedom. Instead, it ends in detention, deportation, or, tragically, death. Law enforcement officers understand this better than anyone. Their victories, like the one in Fort Pierce, are tinged with sorrow. Saving people from cartels often means delivering them back to the very circumstances they risked everything to escape. Children represent the cruelest aspect of this cycle. Smugglers know that parents will pay exorbitant fees if their children are promised safe passage. They also know that children can serve as shields, humanizing their cargo in the eyes of authorities and reducing suspicion. Yet once the journey begins, those same children are exposed to terrifying dangers: rough seas, overcrowded boats, and the trauma of being treated as contraband. In Fort Pierce, 2 children were found among the 30 migrants. Their small figures, juxtaposed with the heavy bales of cocaine, symbolized the twisted, dual economy that cartels exploit. Drugs and children, side by side, both monetized, both trafficked, both stripped of dignity. The community impact in Florida cannot be overlooked either. Fort Pierce, once a quiet coastal town, has now been etched into the narrative of international crime. Residents must grapple with the knowledge that their neighborhoods can be used as staging grounds for global smuggling operations. Trust is shaken when an ordinary Airbnb becomes a cartel command post. Tourism, local pride, and the sense of safety all take a hit. In this sense, the cartel's reach extends beyond drugs and migrants. It erodes the very fabric of community confidence. Law enforcement victories can restore some of that trust, but the scars remain. People remember, long after the headlines fade, that their home was turned into a battlefield. At a national level, the Fort Pierce case forces a reevaluation of how border security is framed. For years, political debate has centered on the land border with Mexico. Walls, checkpoints, and migrant caravans dominated the conversation. But the ocean has always been an open frontier, vast and difficult to police. The surge in maritime and aerial smuggling makes clear that border security is no longer just about the Rio Grande. It is about the Atlantic, the Pacific, and the skies above. A comprehensive strategy must account for all 3 dimensions: land, sea, and air. Anything less leaves a gaping vulnerability, one that cartels will exploit with ruthless efficiency. Technology will play an increasingly vital role. Drones, radar systems, and satellite tracking can extend the eyes of law enforcement far beyond the shoreline. But technology alone cannot replace human judgment and community intelligence. The Fort Pierce raid succeeded in part because local deputies noticed suspicious patterns, tracked unusual activity, and acted on tips. It was the fusion of high-tech resources with old-fashioned police work that made the difference. Going forward, this blend must become the norm. Communities must be empowered to report irregularities, while agencies must be equipped to respond swiftly and decisively. The story also raises uncomfortable ethical questions. How should nations treat migrants who enter through cartel pipelines? On one hand, they are breaking the law. On the other, they are victims of exploitation. Deportation satisfies the letter of the law, but does little to address the human tragedy. Detention ensures order, but inflicts further trauma. Some advocates argue for a more nuanced approach, one that distinguishes between smugglers and those they exploit, offering protection to the vulnerable while punishing the profiteers. Such reforms are politically contentious, yet without them, the cycle of exploitation will persist. Every deported migrant is simply replaced by another desperate individual, funneled through the same machinery. Looking ahead, the Fort Pierce operation will likely be remembered as both a triumph and a warning. It demonstrated the effectiveness of coordinated enforcement and the resilience of communities unwilling to be overrun by criminal networks. But it also revealed the scale of the challenge. Cartels are global enterprises with resources that rival small nations. They are not easily deterred. Each interception forces them to innovate, and each innovation demands a new response. The cycle is endless, exhausting, and costly. Yet the alternative, inaction, is worse. Without pressure, without vigilance, the networks would expand unchecked, and the tragedies would multiply. Perhaps the greatest lesson is that no single agency, county, or country can face this challenge alone. The interconnectedness of smuggling networks demands an equally interconnected response. Just as cartels forge alliances across oceans, so too must law enforcement. Cooperation must transcend bureaucratic rivalries, political cycles, and national borders. If Florida is to avoid becoming a permanent front line, then Fort Pierce must not be an isolated success. It must be the beginning of a sustained, collective effort to confront the cartels wherever they operate. And so, as dawn broke over Fort Pierce on that fateful morning, the arrests and seizures marked more than the end of one operation. They marked the start of a new chapter. The sea, once viewed as a barrier, has become a highway. The smugglers have adapted, the cartels have expanded, and the challenge has grown. But so too has the determination of those who stand against them. Sheriff Del Toro's words, echoed by federal partners, capture both the urgency and the resolve. If we saved even one life today, it was worth it. In truth, they saved more than lives. They preserved a community, disrupted a network, and sent a message that Florida's shores will not be surrendered. Whether that message endures depends on what happens next, on the choices made not just in Fort Pierce, but across America, the Caribbean, and beyond.